The moment my ex-husband said I do, a man in the third row stood up and asked a question about me. 30 seconds later, the wedding stopped. The bride pulled off her ring. And suddenly everyone in that elegant Ohio ballroom was whispering my name. I wasn't even in the country. I was 4,000 miles away, sitting at a small cafe in Lisbon, watching the Tagus River drift past in the late afternoon light. My coffee had gone cold. I remember staring at the screen of my phone while the message from Karen blinked in front of me. Karen lived 2 houses down from the home I used to share with Gary in Dayton. She and her husband had watched our marriage from the outside for 20 years. She wasn't the kind of woman who exaggerated things. Her text read, "Laura, something just happened at Gary's wedding. You might want to call me." I stared at that message for a long time before I answered. Because deep down I had a feeling I already knew. I typed back, "What happened?" Karen called instead of texting. When I answered, I could hear noise in the background, voices, the low rumble of people talking all at once. "Laura," she said, half whispering, half laughing, "you will not believe what just happened." I leaned back in my chair. The cafe smelled like warm pastry and espresso. A tram rattled slowly down the street outside. It was a peaceful afternoon in Lisbon. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, apparently a wedding had just fallen apart. "What happened?" I asked again. Karen took a breath. "Well, Gary's ceremony was going fine. Beautiful setup, white roses everywhere. Vanessa looked like a movie star. Vanessa Crowley, Gary's new fiancée. Or I guess she was supposed to become his wife that day." Karen continued. "The officiant had just asked Gary his vows. He said yes. Everyone clapped. Then Vanessa was about to say hers." She paused. "Then this man stood up." "A guest?" I asked. "I think he's Vanessa's cousin or something. Big guy, loud voice." Karen lowered her voice even more. "And he asked Gary if Vanessa knew the house still belonged to you." I closed my eyes. There it was. Karen went on. "Laura!" The room went dead silent. Gary started laughing like it was a joke. But then your lawyer walked up and handed him some papers. Mark Feldman. I pictured him standing there in that neat gray suit he always wore. Karen said Vanessa grabbed the paper from Gary. "Read it," and her face just changed. I didn't say anything. Then she asked him if he'd lied to her about the house, Karen said. A few seconds passed on the line. And she took off the ring, Karen said, right there at the altar. The cafe around me kept moving. Plates clinking, people talking, someone laughing. Life going on normally. Karen added quietly. The ceremony ended about 2 minutes later. I let out a slow breath. "Wow," I said softly. "You sound awfully calm," Karen replied. "I'm sitting in Portugal," I said. "It's hard to feel dramatic about something happening in Ohio." But the truth was my hands were shaking slightly around the coffee cup. Because everything Karen was describing had started with something very small. A piece of paper Gary had signed 10 years earlier. Karen kept talking. Gary walked out of the room after Vanessa left. People were following him, asking questions. I heard him asking if anyone knew where you were. That part made me smile. Just a little. "Well," I said, looking out at the river that might take him a while. Karen laughed. "You always were the calm one." Maybe. Or maybe I'd just learned patience the hard way. The sunlight across the Tagus shimmered like glass. It was hard to believe that 6 months earlier I had been standing in a very different kitchen. A kitchen in Dayton, Ohio. 22 years of marriage behind me. Boxes on the floor. Gary leaning against the counter while we discussed our divorce like it was a business meeting. I remember the smell of coffee in that kitchen, too. Funny how certain details stick. Gary had said something that afternoon I still remembered word for word. "Laura, I think we both know this isn't working anymore." I didn't argue. By that point, I was too tired to argue. Our marriage had slowly become something quiet and uncomfortable. Gary had always been charming to everyone else. Neighbors loved him. At church gatherings, people would slap him on the back and laugh at his jokes. But inside the house, things felt different. Gary handled the finances. Every dollar. If I bought something small, new shoes, groceries from a different store, even a birthday gift for someone he wanted an explanation. I used to watch him sitting at the kitchen table with a pen tapping against the checkbook. "Do we really need this?" he'd ask. Sometimes it wasn't even about the money. It was about control. After a while, I stopped questioning it. Gary had a daughter from his first marriage, Emily. She was 22 when she moved back into the house after college. Student loans had piled up. Her apartment lease ended. Gary welcomed her back without hesitation. Emily never hated me exactly, but she never accepted me either. She always called me Laura. Never anything warmer. Once during dinner, she said it straight to Gary. "You know Mom would hate this." Gary just shrugged. "She's young," he told me later. "Give her time." Time didn't change much. Then Vanessa appeared. Gary met her through his construction business. She had bought a rental property and wanted it renovated. He said she was a client. Then he started coming home later. Phone calls at night. Text messages he suddenly stepped outside to answer. One evening I smelled unfamiliar perfume on his jacket. I remember holding the sleeve in my hand while he stood in the doorway. "What's going on?" I asked. Gary didn't deny it. He didn't confess either. He just said calmly, "Maybe we've outgrown each other." That sentence ended 22 years of marriage. No yelling. No broken dishes. Just a quiet agreement. The divorce paperwork took a few months. Gary insisted on keeping the house. "It makes sense," he said. "My business is here. Emily's here." I didn't fight him. I was exhausted. I just wanted out. What Gary never understood was that the house situation wasn't as simple as he believed. Because a decade earlier, when his construction company nearly collapsed, something had changed. Gary had been desperate then. Loans piling up. Banks calling. We almost lost everything. My father had died the year before. He left me a small inheritance. Not huge money, but enough to refinance the mortgage and stabilize things. Our lawyer at the time had insisted on one condition. If my inheritance paid off the house, the title had to transfer. Gary agreed without hesitation. He was relieved someone had solved the problem. I remember him signing the paperwork at the dining room table. He barely read it. Just flipped through the pages and signed where the lawyer pointed. That decision saved Gary's business. But it also changed something important. Legally, the house was now mine. Years later, during the divorce, Gary either forgot or never understood that detail. He assumed the house belonged to him. I didn't correct him. At the time, I simply wanted distance. 6 months later, I was living in Lisbon. Small apartment. Morning walks by the river. Learning how to live quietly again. Then Gary announced his engagement online. Pictures everywhere. Vanessa smiling beside him. People commenting about how perfect they looked together. I saw one photo of the house in the background. The same house Gary thought he was bringing his new wife home to. That's when I made one phone call. Mark Feldman answered on the second ring. "Laura," he said, "Portugal treating you well." So far, I told him. Then I explained the situation. Mark was quiet for a moment. "You're still the legal owner," he confirmed. "I know. What do you want to do?" I looked out at the river that afternoon. "I want Gary to understand something," I said. "And what's that?" "That I'm not protecting him anymore." Mark waited. Then he asked the obvious question. "When should we deliver the notice?" I checked the date of Gary's wedding. And I said something that made Mark laugh out loud. During the reception. Mark stopped laughing after a few seconds. "Laura, you're serious," he said. "I am." "You want me to serve a legal notice in the middle of a wedding reception?" "I want the truth delivered at the right moment," I said. There was a pause on the phone. Then Mark let out a long breath. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose technically there's no rule against it." Mark had been my lawyer for nearly 15 years. He knew me well enough to understand something important. I wasn't doing this out of rage. If I had wanted revenge, I could have caused trouble during the divorce. I could have fought for the house outright. I didn't. Instead, I left quietly. But watching Gary celebrate a brand new life built partly on a lie, that was something else. Mark finally spoke again. "You're certain you want to go through with this?" "Yes." "All right," he said, "then I'll make sure everything is handled properly." That was the end of the call. At the time, I thought the plan was simple. Gary would have his wedding. The reception would begin. Mark would approach him privately and deliver the legal notice. Gary would realize the truth. The house he thought he owned, the house he promised Vanessa, wasn't his to give. It was a clean ending. Or at least that's what I expected. But life rarely follows tidy plans, especially when family is involved. A week later, something unexpected happened. My phone buzzed again. This time the name on the screen made me hesitate. Emily. Gary's daughter. She hadn't called me once since the divorce. I stared at the phone long enough for it to stop ringing. A minute later, a text appeared. "Can we talk?" I didn't answer right away. Emily and I had spent 22 years circling each other carefully. Never enemies exactly, but never comfortable either. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I called her back. She picked up immediately. "Laura," she said. Her voice sounded different, less sharp than I remembered. "Hi, Emily." There was an awkward silence. "How's Portugal?" she asked. "It's peaceful." "That sounds nice." Another pause. Then Emily said something I didn't expect. "I know about the house." I leaned back in my chair. "Oh." I looked up the property records, she said. Dad never actually transferred the title after the refinance. "That's correct." Emily sighed. "He really thought it was his." "I know. You didn't correct him during the divorce." "Number." "Why?" I thought about that for a moment. "Because I was tired," I said, "and I wanted to leave without fighting." Emily didn't respond right away. Then she said something quietly. "He treated you badly." Hearing that from her surprised me more than anything else. For years, Emily had defended Gary without hesitation. "What changed your mind?" I asked. "Watching him with Vanessa." The name hung in the air between us. "She's not what he thinks," Emily continued. "How so?" "She likes what Dad can give her." I smiled slightly. "That sounds familiar." Emily gave a small laugh. Then her voice turned serious. "Are you really planning to serve him legal papers during the wedding?" I didn't answer immediately. "So you do know," I said finally. "I know Mark Feldman," Emily replied. "He mentioned something to a friend of mine at the courthouse." "Small towns rarely keep secrets." "Yes," I said, "that's the plan." Emily let out a breath. "Well, that wedding might not go the way Dad expects." "What do you mean?" "I told Vanessa's cousin about the house." I sat up straight. "You what?" "He asked why Dad seemed nervous about finances," Emily said. "So I told him the truth." "Emily." "He loves drama," she added, "the kind that ruins parties." I rubbed my forehead. That wasn't exactly the plan. "I know," Emily said, "but maybe Dad deserves a little public honesty." There was a strange tone in her voice. Not anger. Something closer to disappointment. "Emily," I said carefully, "this isn't about humiliating your father." "I know." "Then why tell someone else?" She hesitated. "Because he never listens to you," she said. The words landed heavier than she probably intended. "He never listened to Mom either," she added quietly. For the first time in years, I heard sadness in her voice instead of hostility. Emily cleared her throat. "Anyway, I just thought you should know things might get messy. Thank you for the warning." "Do you feel bad about any of this?" she asked suddenly. The question surprised me. I thought about it honestly. "I feel sad about the marriage ending," I said. "But not about the truth coming out." Emily seemed to consider that. "Fair enough," she said. Before hanging up, she added one more thing. "Laura." "Yes. I hope you're happy in Lisbon." "I am," I said. After the call ended, I walked outside. The air smelled like salt from the river. A tram rattled past slowly. Tourists filled the sidewalks. Life moving forward. Back in Dayton, though, things were building toward something else entirely. Gary and Vanessa's wedding was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Oakwood Country Club. It was one of the nicer venues in the area. Big ballroom. Manicured golf course. The kind of place where people like to take photos beside rose gardens. Karen sent me pictures the morning of the ceremony. White tents. Flower arrangements. Rows of chairs facing a small outdoor altar. Gary looked confident in the photos. Vanessa looked radiant. I imagine everyone there believed they were witnessing the start of something beautiful. None of them knew that the foundation under that new beginning wasn't real. Around the time the ceremony was starting in Ohio, it was evening in Lisbon. The sky had turned orange over the river. I was sitting in the same cafe again, listening to quiet conversation around me. Part of me wondered what Gary was feeling at that moment. Pride, probably. Relief. Maybe even excitement. He always liked a room full of people watching him. What he didn't know was that the room contained one person who had already decided to speak, and another who was about to walk up with a legal document. When Karen called me that afternoon, everything had already happened. The ceremony had reached the moment where Vanessa was about to say her vows. Then the cousin stood up. According to Karen, the man didn't shout. He just spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Before we go any further, he said, "Gary, did you tell Vanessa the house she's moving into still belongs to Laura?" Karen said the silence afterward was almost physical. People turned their heads. Gary laughed like it was a joke. Then Mark stepped forward with the paperwork. And everything changed. The moment Karen described that silence, I could picture it perfectly. Oakwood Country Club had hosted dozens of weddings over the years. I'd attended a few myself, friends from church, neighbors, even Gary's cousin once. They all followed the same rhythm. Music, smiles, a little nervous laughter, then vows. No one expects a legal question in the middle of that moment. But that's exactly what happened. Karen told me the cousin stood there calmly, hands in his pockets, like he was asking about the weather. "Gary," he said, "did you tell Vanessa the house still belongs to Laura?" At first, Gary laughed. Karen said it was the same laugh he used whenever something uncomfortable came up. "Oh, come on," he said to the room. "What kind of question is that during a wedding?" A few people chuckled nervously. But the cousin didn't sit down. He just shrugged and said, "Seems like something a bride should know." That's when people started whispering. Vanessa looked at Gary. "What is he talking about?" Gary waved his hand. "Nothing, just nonsense." And that might have been the end of it. Except at that exact moment, Mark Feldman stepped forward from the side aisle. Karen said the room shifted instantly. Because Mark wasn't dressed like a guest. He was wearing that same gray suit he wore to court. He walked straight up to Gary and held out a thin envelope. "Mr. Whitman," he said evenly, "I need to deliver this notice regarding the property at 214 Maplewood Drive." That address landed in the room like a dropped plate. Everyone in Dayton knew that house. Gary stared at the envelope. "What is this?" "A legal notice of ownership," Mark said calmly. Vanessa reached for it before Gary could stop her. Karen said you could hear paper sliding as Vanessa unfolded the document. The officiant had stepped aside by then. Guests leaned forward in their chairs. Vanessa read for about 10 seconds. Then she looked up. Her expression had completely changed. "Gary," she said slowly, "this says the house is still in Laura's name." Gary tried to laugh again. "It's just a technicality." Vanessa looked back down at the page. "No," she said quietly, "it's not." The cousin spoke again from the third row. "Looks like she owns the place." At that point, the whispers got louder. Karen said she saw 3 people take out their phones. Gary's face had gone pale. He turned to Mark. "This can't be right." Mark's voice stayed polite. "It is correct. The refinance in 2014 transferred the title to Mrs. Whitman." Vanessa turned toward Gary slowly. "You told me the house was yours." Gary looked around the room. 100 faces staring at him. "It is mine," he said quickly. "We just never changed the paperwork after the divorce." Mark cleared his throat. "The property title remains legally unchanged." Vanessa's voice got sharper. "So you don't actually own the house?" Gary didn't answer right away. Karen said that silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. But it felt much longer. Vanessa lowered the paper. "You promised we'd move in there after the honeymoon." Gary reached for her arm. "Vanessa, let's talk about this later." "No," she said. Her voice echoed through the room. "We're talking about it now." The officiant shifted awkwardly. Guests looked back and forth between them. Someone near the back muttered, "Oh boy." Gary tried again. "It's still basically my house." Vanessa stared at him. "You told me it was fully paid off." Gary hesitated. That hesitation said everything. Vanessa slipped the engagement ring off her finger. Karen said you could hear someone gasp. She held the ring in her hand for a moment. Then she placed it in Gary's palm. "You lied to me," she said. Gary shook his head. No, this is just paperwork. We can fix it." Vanessa stepped back. "If you lied about something this big, what else have you lied about?" No one in the room spoke. The cousin leaned back in his chair like he'd just finished watching a movie. Vanessa looked toward the guests. "I'm not marrying someone who can't even tell the truth about where we're going to live." Gary reached for her again. "Vanessa, don't do this." But she was already walking away. Her heels clicked sharply across the wooden floor. Karen said the entire room followed her with their eyes. Vanessa's mother stood up halfway unsure whether to follow. The officiant closed his folder quietly. Gary stood at the altar holding a ring and a legal notice. And suddenly the wedding was over. Karen told me the reception never really started. People gathered in small circles whispering. The catering staff stood awkwardly beside untouched trays of food. Gary walked out of the ballroom 10 minutes later. Emily followed him outside. Karen said she watched from the window. They argued in the parking lot for a while. Gary kept gesturing with the papers in his hand. Finally, he got into his car and drove away. Karen lowered her voice when she told me the next part. The first thing he asked Emily was where you were. I looked out at the river again. That must have been an interesting conversation. Karen laughed softly. She told him you'd moved overseas. What did he say? He said he needed to talk to you. Of course he did. Back in Dayton, Gary was probably trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. From his perspective, it must have felt like the world had turned upside down in 5 minutes. But from mine, the truth had just taken its time catching up. Later that evening, after my call with Karen ended, I walked along the river. Lisbon glowed at night. Street musicians played near the bridge. Couples sat along the waterfront sharing wine. I thought about Gary standing in that empty ballroom, thinking about the house, thinking about me. For 22 years I had protected his reputation, explained away his behavior, covered for his mistakes. But the day I left Dayton, that protection ended. Now the truth belonged to him, and he had to decide what to do with it. 3 days later my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered anyway. There was breathing on the other end for a moment. Then Gary's voice. Laura. He sounded exhausted. And angry. Laura. Gary's voice sounded rough, like he hadn't slept much. For a moment neither of us spoke. Outside my apartment window, the evening sun was fading over the Tagus River. A boat moved slowly across the water. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing music. 4,000 miles away, Gary Whitman was breathing hard into his phone. Finally, he said it. How could you do this to me? I leaned back in my chair. I didn't do anything to you, Gary. You had a lawyer show up at my wedding. You signed the paperwork 10 years ago. That's not the point. His voice rose enough that I had to move the phone away from my ear. I waited. Eventually, he let out a frustrated breath. You embarrassed me, he said. No, I replied calmly. You embarrassed yourself. Silence again. Gary had always hated silence. He filled it quickly. You knew what that house meant to me. I knew what the truth was. You could have said something during the divorce. I could have, I agreed. Then why didn't you? That was a fair question. For a long moment I watched the river outside my window before answering. Because I was tired, Gary, and I wanted to leave peacefully. He scoffed. Well, this wasn't peaceful. No, I said quietly, but neither was the way our marriage ended. Gary didn't reply to that. Instead, he asked the question that really mattered to him. What do you want? Straight to the point. That part of Gary had never changed. I want the house sold, I said. You can't be serious. It's the cleanest solution. That's my home. No, I said gently. It's the property you've been living in. Gary made a frustrated sound. You're doing this out of spite. I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. If I wanted spite, I would have done this during the divorce. That was true. I could have forced the issue months earlier. But the timing had mattered. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I wanted clarity. Gary's voice softened a little. Vanessa left, he said. I heard. She won't return my calls. I'm not surprised. You ruined my life. That accusation hung between us for a moment. Then I said something I'd thought about for a long time. No, Gary, I stopped fixing it for you. He didn't respond. For years I had quietly smoothed over problems, explained Gary's behavior to neighbors, defended him to Emily, covered financial mistakes, handled things so he wouldn't look bad. The day I moved to Lisbon, that job ended. Eventually, Gary spoke again. If we sell the house, what happens next? We split the proceeds according to the divorce agreement. And then we go our separate ways. Another long pause. Gary sighed heavily. I need time to think. That's fair. Before hanging up, he said something unexpected. Emily knew. Yes, I said. She didn't warn me. I didn't answer that. Gary laughed bitterly. I guess everyone was in on this except me. That's not true. What do you mean? You signed the papers, I said. You were always part of it. He didn't like that answer. We ended the call shortly after. Over the next few weeks, Gary called twice more. The first time to argue. The second time to negotiate. Eventually, reality settled in. Mark handled most of the legal details. The house went on the market that fall. I didn't return to Dayton. I didn't want to reopen old memories. Mark kept me informed by email. Apparently, the house sold faster than expected. The neighborhood was still desirable. Big trees. Quiet streets. Families looking for good schools. 6 months after Gary's wedding collapsed, the sale was final. My half of the proceeds transferred to my bank account a few days later. I used the money to buy a small apartment overlooking the Tagus. Nothing fancy. But it had tall windows and a narrow balcony. On clear mornings, I could see the river stretching all the way to the bridge. The first night after moving in, I sat outside with a glass of wine and thought about everything that had happened. Gary's wedding. The shocked silence in that ballroom. Vanessa walking away. The cousin asking his question. All of it felt strangely distant now. Not dramatic. Just finished. A few months later, Karen sent me another message. You won't believe this, she wrote. What I replied. Gary moved into a condo near the mall. I smiled when I read that. Life had moved on for both of us. Different directions. Different homes. And maybe that was the point all along. Because the truth is, the house was never the real issue. Respect was. For years, I believed keeping the peace meant staying quiet. Letting things slide. Protecting Gary from consequences. But somewhere between Dayton and Lisbon, I realized something simple. Peace isn't silence. Peace is honesty. Even when honesty is uncomfortable. Now most mornings I sit on my balcony with coffee. Boats drift along the river. The city wakes slowly. Sometimes I think about that wedding day in Ohio. Not with anger. Just with clarity. Gary had built a future on assumptions. Eventually the truth caught up. And once it did, everything changed. If you've ever walked away from a long marriage and wondered whether you did the right thing, I understand that feeling. Sometimes dignity arrives quietly. Not with shouting. Not with revenge. Just with the moment you stop carrying someone else's mistakes. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're always welcome here.